Welcome back, everybody. I'm thrilled to introduce you to my friend, Kimberlee Joseph. We actually met inside of Bridges Graduate School, and Bridges is a school for twice exceptional students, and then they branched into graduate studies, and Kimberlee and I have been their guinea pigs, their first cohort. And we met there and we just have hit it off, and it's been so fun. So we wanted to talk about in this episode twice exceptionality and the dilemmas that come with that. And so Kimberlee, welcome to the show. It's so fun to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I always love to chat with you, and I'm so glad we've kept that connection going. I love following what you're doing. So thanks for having me here.
Yeah, absolutely. So since graduating, you ended up being a year ahead of me just because I took a break during the pandemic, but you forged ahead and kept going. And now I'm almost done. So, but I would love to hear, like, what have you been interested or focused on since graduating from Bridges, and where's your work taking you these days?
When I first came out of Bridges, I was doing a lot of focusing on working directly with parents and speaking to parents groups around advocating for their own twice exceptional learners, around the kind of parent teacher school communication piece, and how we can keep that positively focused and productive, how to navigate the IEP process with a more positive lens around strengths, which can be kind of challenging in that system, depending on your district, the state you live in. There's so many things that impact that and the people who are on the team. So kind of training parents to keep an eye toward those strengths and how we can use those strengths to support our kids in the classroom, and how we can keep open, positive line of communication with our children's educators. So I have done quite a bit of that. My action research was around writing, in particular, the challenges around writing with twice exceptional students. And I'm interested in pursuing that a little bit more, working on a workbook and some materials for educators to use, home educators and educators in a more traditional environment to use with 2E kids who are struggling with writing, just to sort of get the wheels turning. So that's kind of where I'm at. And I think that this field is so interesting and there's so many opportunities, and I'm so happy to see that it's really growing and moving. And we're hearing about it more.
Yes, it's so fun to hear that phrase twice exceptionality, 2E, become a little more mainstream. But for those of you that may be listening, that might be new to you. So let's define it for them. Kimberlee, how would you define twice exceptionality?
There's several, as you know, that, we hear lots of different definitions, but when I think about twice exceptional learners, I really think about the kids who are experiencing, they have these strengths, really unique strengths on kind of one end of their spectrum, and they're dealing with some challenges on another. And when I say that, it kind of sounds like the human experience, right? We all have a very unique pattern of strengths and challenges. But when you think of a twice exceptional learner, you're thinking about a kiddo who it's like 10x, it's really, really pronounced for them. And that leads to a very unique experience in the world, in the classroom, with learning. And, so a lot of things fall under that. These can be dyslexia, autism, ADHD, anxiety, emotional struggles, academic struggles, developmental issues, but along with that gifted piece. So there's so many definitions. I really try to stick with just looking at those kids who are kind of sitting on both ends of the strength and challenge spectrum.
Yes, absolutely. I vividly remember when we were first in the Bridges program, that was one of our challenges, like one of our assignments was come up with an elevator pitch for what twice exceptionality is. Because there are so many ways to define it. And I like your definition. And we learned from Dr. Baum that she describes it as like the blue and the yellow, the green. We've got the strengths and the weaknesses, and it creates a unique situation for that student. So they can exist inside the same person. And in this show, we've talked to Dylan Lynn, who is twice exceptional herself. When you watch and listen to her interview, it's very clear. This is a very intelligent person.
Mm-hmm.
And her strengths lie in English and communication, and really clear that that comes through. And so the fact that she was struggling so much in mathematics her whole life and into college, it didn't really come to a head. But she didn't realize that it wasn't normal to be spending hours and hours and hours trying to learn this when she was younger, until she got to college and the professors kind of gave her a furrowed brow, like, you really should just give up.
Mm-hmm.
And she refused to accept that. And so anyways, if you're watching, go back and watch Dylan's interview, because she's a beautiful example of what twice exceptionality is. And what's awesome is once she understood what was going on, she used intuitively her strength to support the weakness. And so she takes math, writes it out in English.
Hmm.
So instead of just saying 2x squared, she's writing 2 TWO and writes out squared to help her translate this very abstract idea into English, which makes sense to her,
Which is her area of strength.
which is her area of strength, which is really cool, right? When you think
Mm-hmm.
about it. So she's got that unique brain wiring, and that is kind of the dilemma, right? Like, the world has made her life a little more difficult as far as getting that access, but she has figured out how to use her strengths to increase her access to those parts that are harder for her. And that's kind of the name of the game with twice
Mm-hmm.
exceptionality. So I'm curious for you, you're interested in the writing side. So what kinds of things are you seeing are struggles for twice exceptional students around writing?
Writing is just such a tricky thing for so many kids. You know, Many kids, gifted kids, can struggle with writing. There's a lot going on when we ask a child to organize a written piece of work. So there's, working memory. They have to remember what they wanted to say. They need to have the knowledge base about what they wanted to say. They need to be able to remain engaged in the process long enough to get something out. For some kids, there are, actual motor, their hands
Mhm.
just can't move as fast as they need them to, or, they may have dysgraphia, as, and related to handwriting. So even for really typically developing learners, it's complex. Writing is complex.
Yes.
So when you're looking at a child who's very asynchronously developing, for instance, a child who has just a massive knowledge base about something, whose mind is thinking on a topic, but maybe has some executive functioning challenges around organizing that writing,
Mhm.
working memory challenges around keeping all of these massive thoughts in their head long enough for their hand to be able to catch up to get them out.
Yes.
Um, there are just many things that can go into making writing a difficult process. And unfortunately, for a lot of kiddos, that can lead to a disengagement from the writing process, a resistance to the writing process. It becomes incredibly frustrating. And in the case of 2E kids, some of that frustration comes from the fact that they have a lot to say that they want to share.
Mhm.
They
Mhm.
know, and then there's I've always thought of it as like a funnel. There's all these thoughts and all this knowledge, and it's funneling down, and they just can't get everything out that they want to share. And that's very frustrating.
Oh,
So you
yeah.
may see work refusal that you can just see, like, I know kiddos who are like, I don't pick up a pencil. I'm done. Like, this process doesn't work for me. Let's talk about it. I'm not writing. And as we know, in a conventional school environment, that's tough.
Yeah.
You really have to work with that. So, I think there's many ways it impacts them. The way that I've liked to focus on is improving the time that they're willing to positively engage with the writing process.
Mhm.
Um, a lot, unfortunately, many kids, when they've had this frustration for multiple years, they're turning off to the writing process, they may start to lose that resilience and the willingness to engage. It's very uncomfortable and frustrating. And we have to do some work to kind of like back off of it and make it a more palatable experience for them,
Yes.
and start to undo some of that trauma around it, and distress around that process. And that gets tougher as they're getting older and writing is being required
More?
in so many
Oh,
subjects,
yes,
as you know, like you
yes.
literally can't escape it, right?
Oh,
So that can have an impact in many academic subjects that actually have nothing to do with writing, if they could just share their knowledge in another way. But we can see that start to impact everything. So I'm trying to I'm very interested in looking at the point of where can we jump in with these kiddos and kind of stop that process, that response to writing that's so negative and triggers that fight or flight response for them. And how can we undo that a little so they can engage with the process?
absolutely. I think you would really enjoy the interview with Stephen Pfeiffer, who creates diagnostics. And right before the pandemic, he released what's called the FAW, F-A-W, Pfeiffer Assessment of Writing. And he's looking at exactly what you were just talking about, like the mechanics of actually forming the letters and the motor skills that are going into that, but also like the dyslexia impacting it in the spelling and those
Mm-hmm.
kinds of things. And then lastly, getting all that big, beautiful knowledge, that's what he said, like onto the paper. Can you do it?
Mm-hmm.
And then that gives you some data points to start, applying exactly what you're talking about, some interventions to help support. And that's basically the heart of twice exceptional education,
Mm-hmm.
is figuring out where the strengths and the weaknesses are, and then adjusting your curriculum and your lessons to help support that student in those areas of weaknesses using their strengths. So it's
Well, and I
really
think
powerful.
another, also we need to make sure we're leaving room and supporting a focus on their strengths and their talents just for the sake of growing. They
Mhm.
deserve the opportunity to grow and learn and show what they know in all subjects, with accommodations to allow for the writing, and instead of forcing writing to negatively impact every
Oh, yeah.
subject that they're in. So it's important that we're not only accommodating, and maybe that means we're getting them typing as early as possible, which can help with speed, or they're using a voice to text accommodation, whatever that is. Of course, they still need support learning and feeling more comfortable with the writing process, but we need
Mhm.
to make sure we're giving them avenues to grow in their areas of strength and their areas of interest without that kind of, speed bump or the roadblock of
Yes,
the
big
writing
bump.
challenge.
Yes.
So unfortunately, I think kind of in the structure that we have, what can happen is a lot of really well-meaning educators and parents, all of us, we want to help kids who are struggling. We're really focusing on that deficit and we want to get them what they need to get better in that, to grow in that area. But what can happen is slowly but surely, all of the focus is getting shifted over to what they can't do.
Mhm.
And slowly but surely, less and less time and support is being dedicated to allowing them to exist from a place of strength as well.
Yes. Yes. I would totally agree with that. Now, just backing up a little bit to what you were saying about asynchronous development, in case parents are not familiar with that, how would you define asynchronous development? And like, let's go through some examples of what that might look like, maybe in the math side, but also, just twice exceptional in general.
Sure, sure. Um, Asynchronous looks, I think, a little bit different for every kiddo, every twice exceptional kiddo. But some examples you might see, and I've heard, gosh, and I'm hesitant to even say it because I don't know who originally came up with the 5, 10, 15 rule. Have you heard this?
I haven't
That
heard this rule.
Okay, so I've heard it I can't remember the last person I heard referencing this, but that a child who's asynchronously developing, which can be a gifted child, which can be, I think it's more extreme often in exceptional children, but is a child who might be 10, so physically they're 10,
Mhm.
cognitively and academically they might be 15 in some areas, and socially and emotionally they might be closer to 5. That social stuff is not coming online yet. Or maybe that's reversed. Maybe if you
Yeah.
just look at their academic profile, perhaps they are greatly excelling in reading and writing, and they're really struggling in mathematics. So that's a big discrepancy in their abilities. I feel like I frequently see that social component is often there, or the
Mhm.
executive functioning skills kind of lagging behind the cognitive abilities. So I hate to generalize because really, truly, every 2E kid is so, so different. But if you look close enough at your kiddo, you're going to see, wow, they can just fly in this area. And this is just consistently a struggle.
Yeah.
And you might see that my experience, that is not fixed. You're sort of seeing some movement in that sometimes for kiddos as they're developing. But so that would be asynchronous. And a lot of people will use it to refer to sort of the social asynchrony. But I think it also can apply to the academic profile or, lots of things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit it right on the head. Asynchrony is so difficult. But we have to remember too, like, even in the norm, in the center, there's asynchrony happening, right? It's part of the human experience as well. And that when we talk about what's normal, we're talking about like the average, but everyone falls. That's why we have average.
Well, the average is a myth, right? The average is nobody.
Exactly.
You're trying to average everyone out. But everyone's an individual and nobody's, really in that middle. But yeah, it's tricky. And I think it can lead, for kids whose asynchrony is kind of pronounced and extreme, it can lead to expectations put on them by both parents and educators, either way, positively or negatively. If they're really capable at certain times of doing things in certain environments at certain times, and then in others they struggle to do it, even the same thing sometime. They can be perceived as lazy or not trying or not applying themselves, or on the, inverse, if they really struggle in certain environments, sometimes the expectation is that they can't excel in any environment. So it's, every interaction with the child is kind of a snapshot of where they are in time, what they're doing right now in the place, the environment they're in, and, how able they are to engage effectively with something. And when you are a very asynchronous learner, that can jump around, right? Depending on where you're at.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you. And I want to hear more about like advocacy work, because I think a lot of parents are just embarking on this, like realizing, okay, my kid has some diagnoses now and they're launching into this world of like getting help and extra support. And we receive emails from parents who are irate and mad, like the school should be doing this, and they're frustrated, right? Because now this is negatively impacting their financials and their home and whatnot. So I would love to hear more about like some of the things you're doing and coaching parents to do around advocacy. What are some rules or guidelines we could follow when we're advocating for these students?
Oh, parent advocacy. I just want to take a second to acknowledge what a job that is. And if any parent is out there listening right now who's like feeling kind of at the end of their rope or frustrated or exhausted or at a loss, boy, I really feel you. I understand what it's like to be right there. I think the most important thing, and it's really challenging sometimes, is to make sure you are keeping a positive, open line of communication with your child's teachers. And that can feel challenging. I mean, especially in this moment in education, I think everyone in education is sort of pushed to their limit or has spent a couple of years just being really pushed to their limit, and there's a lot of demands on everyone and everyone's feeling a little raw. So that can be tough, but I think it's appropriate to acknowledge that and make sure we are acknowledging all that our children's teachers and if they have an IEP, their IEP team, all that they are doing. Again, we're talking about a strength-based focus, right? And that applies to everyone on the team.
Yeah.
And, we need to acknowledge that, because things can devolve pretty rapidly if we walk into a meeting and are immediately into our list of things that are not being done, even though that's totally valid in many cases, and we need to get there eventually. It's kind of, how do we open that interaction? And everybody it's important to acknowledge what's working. So if you can find something that's working, and sometimes you may be walking into that engagement and like, it feels like nothing's working. It feels like the whole thing is a disaster. I'm inclined to think about something that is working for my child even outside of the school environment and begin with that. So that can be at home, something we're seeing that's really working, for Johnny is XYZ and he's having some success in this area. How can we bring that into the school environment? So even though it can be difficult, try to start from something that's positive. And then, I don't know how deeply you want to go into, I do a seminar about a one sheet, which is kind of introducing your child to their teachers. And it's really focused on younger children.
Yeah.
And it's a process that eventually, ideally, a child or a learner would take over as a piece of self-advocacy. That looks like sharing struggles and successes that the child has had with really easy tips around how to support the child in the environment. It's a lot to go into in just a 30-minute podcast, but just to say, it's important that we're leveraging our own experience as parents, as the person who is, frequently helping to regulate our child or watching our child's experience. And we're putting that into as clear and concise a communication as we can with bullet points that may support and help the teacher. And to remember that we're not saying, do this, do this, do this. It's in the spirit of, if this happens, you might find that this will help. The intention is, I want to support you. I want to kind of let you know what we've experienced already so that you're starting with some knowledge about my kiddo. And this is particularly helpful for kids who might struggle either behaviorally or engagement wise in the classroom. So in the net, that is something I advise parents to do. It's a little bit more involved and we really get into what that looks like to write it. But I think that would be my number one piece of advice.
I love that. I like that you're mentioning keep it positive. Yeah, as much as you can. Because the truth is, I think we said this earlier, most educators get into education because they want to make a difference. It's not because they're there to torture your child.
Absolutely.
Their life is hell. That's not why they're there. They're stuck inside of a system that is outdated, that doesn't really look at the eye in the IEP. And so, trying to phrase everything as you can, as positive as you can, is going to be in your favor.
And that leads me actually just to one more little thing I'd like to add around the IEP. Different teams, I've worked with different teams, and different teams will do a little bit more around, there's always a strength, there's a little section for a learner's strengths on the IEP. And I have seen that range anywhere from a very detailed look at a learner's academic and social strengths to something as simple as likes baseball and chess. We need to, as parents, make sure that that piece of the IEP is just as dense around what our child does well, what they're interested in, what their strengths are. That needs to be specific. That needs to be complete. That needs to help paint a picture of your child as a whole child, because the rest of the IEP is going to be around their challenges and what they need support to grow in. And the more information we have in that strength area, it gives a teacher who may not know your child, or a team who may not know your child, some real information around them as a whole child and how they can, leverage those strengths and those interests to engage your child. So that's an important piece. And I think sometimes it can get get looked over in that process.
Yeah, I agree. And the other thing that I think is fascinating about your experience, Kimberlee, is I love that you're willing to embrace stuff that might feel a little scary, in the pursuit of helping children that are twice exceptional, because you have a twice exceptional child yourself. And so I would love for you to share a little bit of your journey with your son and finding the best fit for him and his education. Because I think other parents are I think the pandemic opened a lot of parents' eyes to how broken the system is, but now feel trapped. I don't even know where to go next with this or how to help.
I agree with your observation. I certainly had many conversations with fellow parents during the course of the pandemic who were kind of getting first time, real-time eyeballs on their child's learning process, and being like, what? I didn't realize that this is what was going on. That was actually probably the most frequent conversation I was having with other parents in the first 6 months of the pandemic. Everybody was obviously very stressed, and online learning was really evolving during that time. I don't know how it was where you are. We were fully online for a year and a half. So our
Oh,
schools didn't
goodness.
go back until the end of the second year.
Mm,
I will tell you that we had a very unusual experience around online learning. The conventional classroom was not an ideal fit for
mhm,
my son. We worked for a long time. I worked very closely with his team to help make it a better fit. Unfortunately, it was challenging around areas of strength and giftedness that there in California, there's not a ton of support in
mhm.
that area. And so we were really struggling to get him work in his areas of strength that were as challenging as he needed to remain engaged in the classroom. And his areas of challenge were kind of, exacerbated by that, I would say. And it was getting to be pretty tough. And then online learning came and he was in love with online learning. It was like the greatest thing that ever happened to him, and I was talking with so many other parents who really weren't having that experience. And I have another child who was not in love with online learning, it wasn't for her, but he really had more time to dive into his areas of interest. He loved it. And so we ended up shifting to an online micro school for the second year, which was phenomenal. And as that school closed after that second year of the pandemic, and he's homeschooling now officially, and he's joined an online learning community that has been remarkable. He loves it. We're able to work in the areas where he really needs a lot of one-to-one assistance, he's able to do that. And then he
Mhm.
can work at the speed and the level and the interest in other areas. So for us, that has really worked. Has it been a sacrifice in some ways and a challenge? Yeah,
Sure.
sure
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
Um, but he loves learning again. And it was kind of getting to the point where it was just a struggle and it was tough to see. And I'm so excited to see him kind of excited again and, really being
Re-engage.
able to grow and connect and dive into things deeply. So I understand that's not the experience for everyone. For a lot of parents, it was, I have a master's degree in education and I still felt
Yeah.
overwhelmed by the
Yeah.
concept, of managing my kids' education at home. So I 100% get that that's not for every family. Um, and I will also acknowledge that although it was becoming clear to me that a conventional environment wasn't ideal, we as parents have to sort of undo all of the conditioning we've had about education in our life.
Mhm.
And, I'm 47 years old. For the entire 47 years, school has looked like a classroom on a
Yeah.
campus that you
Yeah.
went to with five other kids. And that's what school was.
Mhm.
And it took a lot of self-reflection, a lot of understanding, really acknowledging, like, I think something different will be better, and then I always say, we got pushed into that something different and we just sort of went from there. But it's scary.
It is
It's
scary.
scary. Even
Yeah.
when it's not working for your kid, it's really scary to let go of a system that's been part of our entire framework in our life, for so
Yeah.
long. So,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And the human brain doesn't want you to change things up. I mean, its goal is to, keep
right.
things the same so it's not burning so much calories. And like just from an evolutionary standpoint, that's the brain's job. And so when you introduce change, it's causing all this extra work in the brain. And so that's why it's so hard
Yeah.
to shift and do something so differently. It's like it just doesn't compute what
Yeah.
we're doing here.
Well,
So
and to find the resource,
yeah, yeah,
it's tough,
it's
and in some
really
ways I
tough.
feel like, um, because there was such a shift to more resources going online during the pandemic. And I hope that what comes of that as things kind of return to normal is that there are new pathways and that there are new schools that have developed and there's new ways of learning. It's become a little bit more accessible. Um, even if that is an online after school class in your child's area of interest that didn't
Yeah,
exist 2 years ago.
yeah,
You know, even you look at the explosion of OutSchool and some schools that are more focused toward asynchronous learners online, offering those classes in really unique areas of interest that I think you just wouldn't have seen 3 years ago. I really hope that that remains available and accessible to a wider variety of, you know, to all kinds of learners to be able to get that. And I think that's a silver lining, you know, hopefully, that has come out of this collective experience that we've had.
Yes, I think it definitely helps sped up parents accepting that good learning can happen online. And I'm grateful for that, because we had kind of the same thing during the pandemic. We had tons of people rushing to us because we'd already been online for years before this pandemic.
Right.
So we had to figure it out, right? And they were finally willing, like, oh, please help us, and saw that it is viable, that it works. And I'm with you. I hope we don't lose some of that. But Zoom fatigue is a real thing. I get it. I've been on Zoom all day and I am wiped out.
Simultaneously to kids going to Zoom online all day, we were doing the first summer of our graduate program online all day.
Yes.
And I mean, that was like 9 hours a day. And I remember thinking, boy, this is really giving me a lot of empathy and a lot of understanding for what teachers and students are going through right now, because this is so hard, you know, and I think a lot of parents who have been working on Zoom, you know, are probably feeling that too. You know, I'm like, oh, I'm checking my phone under the table. Like, you know, I'm not developing, I do not have good habits here right now on this Zoom. So, you know, I really felt for a 6-year-old who was trying to sit in front of a Zoom. But again, for some kids, it was a revelation.
Yeah, it really was.
You know?
Yeah.
And it just emphasizes how different and unique the learning needs of many students are. Yeah, it's been interesting.
Yes, I think being twice exceptional, yes, it has like its own challenges, and yeah, everyone can relate to that. So it's been so fun to have you here with me. Was there anything else I should have asked or should have included? You are just a wealth of knowledge, and you and I often get trapped on the phone chatting forever. And so I don't want to necessarily make everyone listen to us chat for hours, but there's so many things that we could go down. Is there something I should have asked you that I haven't?
I think that it's important for parents to know, and you might have to dig a bit, but especially if you're in the process of communicating with your child's school. I want to say two things. One is if you're in the process of beginning to support your learner in the classroom and in communication, maybe not even in an IEP process, but just having those opening conversations with teachers, it is important to know that there is a lot of research and science becoming available around the importance of strength-based, focusing on learners' strengths and talents over a solely deficit-based approach to supporting kids. And you can find that science, and some processes and some, you know, schools are just, they're kind of lagging a little bit behind what is coming to be known around the science of engagement and supporting the well-being and the mental health of children. I think that now we're seeing a growing focus on the mental health, and it's important to bring that piece to teachers that are working with your child, that, hey, like, focusing on strengths and giving my child, or all children, the opportunity to grow in that area despite their challenge areas, right, that is vital for their self-concept, for their mental health, for their growth. They can't go to school and do nothing but like remediation support and typical work. Like, if I went to work all day long for 8 hours and what I was being asked to do all day was the thing that is the hardest for me, and I wasn't having an opportunity to shine and show what I can do in other areas, I'm pretty quickly not gonna want to go.
Exactly.
You know? So, you know, in addition to being able to use those strengths to support growth in the areas of challenge, sometimes we just really need to give them that chance to shine and remove that barrier of that challenge and let them show what they know. And that's really vital. And, you know, so anyway, those papers are out there. You can look at some of the work of Dr. Baum, who you've referenced, you know, who has done work showing that ability, that access to accelerated programs in certain areas helps with self-regulation and self-concept. And my action research around writing that I did with my colleague Maren Lenehan at Bridges, we saw an increase when children were accessing writing through a place of strength and interest. We saw an increase in the amount of time that they were willing and able to positively engage in that activity, right?
Yes.
So it's like a non-negotiable, you know, and I think that every student benefits from it, but for 2E kids who can sometimes be kind of the canary in the coal mine of an educational environment that's not fitting them, like we kind of see that distress in them quicker, sooner. It's vital. It's vital. And we owe it to them, and they deserve to be able to grow in these areas. And just to keep an eye on that, you know, and just remember that.
Absolutely. Let's wrap this up with some suggestions of books that we've read around this idea of giftedness and struggles and twice exceptionality. Right off the top of my head, I'm thinking of Ungifted by Scott Barry Kaufman, and also The Inconvenient Student, I think is what it's called.
I don't know that one. I'm gonna read that one.
That one's on the smaller side, but I love it because I felt very seen as a parent of a twice exceptional child. I walked away feeling like, this guy gets it. He gets what it's like. And so he's writing about, you know, it's inconvenient to have this student with these unique blends and challenges, because some days you're dealing with a 13-year-old that's behaving like a toddler. And then other days they're having very profound conversations with you, you know. So that book's really good and easy. It's a fast read. I think it's called The Inconvenient Student. If it's not, I will have it correct in the video down below. What about you?
There's speaking of Scott Barry Kaufman, he edited a series of essays and chapters, and I believe the book is called Twice Exceptional. Gosh, I have it like on my bookshelf here, but I don't want to jump up during this. It's either called Twice Exceptional or The Twice Exceptional Student. I'll shoot you the information, and you can put it below too. You know, it's a yellow book.
I have it right behind me. It's yellow. Yeah.
It's a good one for parents. It's a little dense. Like some of the chapters are directed at educators, and some I feel like are a little bit more accessible to parents, but it is a good place to get some information that you can share with educators, just some real quick snippets and some of the research that's been done behind that. Another one that I'm going to go out on a limb and recommend it without having read it, because I've read her other book, is Emily Kircher-Morris did a great book for teachers recently, and she's just released one for parents. And I have not read it yet, but I found the one that she had directed at educators around twice exceptional learners in the classroom to be very accessible, very actionable, not overwhelming, you know, easy to consume, but super informative. And so I am assuming that her book directed at parents will be the same, and I'm looking forward to reading it myself. So those are two off the top of my head that I would recommend.
Yeah, and one that we read in one of our classes that isn't necessarily twice exceptional, but I mean, it's written by Scott Barry Kaufman. We read Wired to Create, and I loved that book on so many levels, because I felt like I could see a lot of myself in that book, but also people in my family and close friends. It kind of helps explain some of the eccentric things that those who are highly creative or driven to accomplish something, some of the behaviors they engage in, the things that they're doing. And it is twice exceptionality. Again, like, how do they keep, I don't know, quote unquote, sane when they're, you know, in these frenzies of creation. I really enjoyed that book too, walking away again, feeling very seen, heard, and understood through that book. That was one of my favorites. That wasn't necessarily, this is twice exceptional, but it totally applied. Awesome. We'll link those up in the video down below. Anything else we should wrap up with before we go? Any other questions you wanted to cover, or?
No, just again, I like to wrap up with a moment of solidarity for parents who are out there kind of like fighting the good fight for their twice exceptional, for all neurodivergent kids. You know, it's such a big, important job. And I just always like to just tell them that I see them and I know the work that they're doing, and it's big.
It is big. Yes. Yes, absolutely. Feel free to connect with Kimberlee. I'm going to have your contact info. I think you have a website, or you're close to having a website from what I remember.
It's up,
It's
but
up.
it's in the process. So, but it is today. It is up. Let's put it that way.
Okay, we'll
We've been
have
tweaking it.
the link for you all if you want to connect with Kimberlee and talk about some of the advocacy stuff. And the writing is so fascinating. I'm so excited that you're doing that work. Before we go, we always end up with sharing a little meme. And so I found one that is bad. It's bad and good. I'm just not going to deny it anymore. All right, her. What's your favorite literary vampire? Me, the one in Sesame Street. Her, he doesn't count. Oh, I can assure you that he does. Wah, wah. So dumb. But totally worth it.
I have a kid who's gonna love that. I'm gonna leave here and tell it to him.
Perfect. Thank you so much for being here.